What if Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once shook Europe with his ambition and brilliance, had at his command a weapon centuries ahead of its time? A weapon so powerful that it could erase cities in a single moment, shatter armies without battle, and make kings and emperors tremble before him. What if Napoleon had nuclear weapons? To imagine this is to step into one of history's most dramatic crossroads. Napoleon, the general who rose from obscurity in Corsica, who carved an empire across Europe with steel and fire, who defied monarchies and redrew the map of the continent, was already a figure, larger than life. But his age was defined by muskets, cannons, and cavalry charges. Battles were won through discipline, maneuver, and sheer endurance. Now place into that world a weapon of the 20th century, a weapon that ended World War II in an instant, the atomic bomb. The contrast is staggering. At the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was locked in near constant war. Britain ruled the seas, Austria and Prussia guarded their old monarchies, and Russia loomed to the east. Napoleon's France was encircled by enemies, all desperate to stop him. Every campaign was a gamble of men, muskets, and morale. The Napoleonic Wars consumed millions of lives. Yet for all their size, battles like Austerlitz, Borodino, or Waterloo were still decided by lines of infantry, cavalry charges, and the thunder of cannons. Now imagine one bomb, falling upon a city or an army camp, unleashing heat brighter than the sun, a fireball that could consume tens of thousands of men in seconds. The balance of power would be utterly transformed. First, we must understand what nuclear weapons actually represent. A single bomb, even one of the earliest designs used in the mid-20th century, could unleash the destructive force of thousands of cannons firing at once. Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 were not destroyed by long sieges, but by two bombs, each small by modern standards, yet capable of leveling entire cities. If Napoleon possessed such a device in 1805, when his grand army marched across Europe, he would hold in his hands not just a weapon, but the power to decide the fate of nations in an instant. Picture the Battle of Austerlitz, often called his masterpiece. In reality, Napoleon lured the Austrians and Russians into a trap, then crushed them with superior tactics. But with a nuclear bomb, there would be no need for traps, no need for brilliant maneuver. He could simply annihilate the heart of the enemy army, leaving only silence and ruin. The psychological impact alone would shatter coalitions before they even formed. Monarchs who feared French muskets would now fear total annihilation. Britain, secure across the Channel with its navy, would no longer be safe. A single bomb on London could decapitate the British war effort in one stroke. Yet let us not assume this power could be used without consequence. Nuclear weapons are not just tools of destruction, they are tools of fear, politics, and control. Napoleon, ever the strategist, would understand their symbolic weight. A demonstration of such force, perhaps detonating one on an uninhabited plain before the eyes of his enemies, could terrify them into submission without even shedding blood. But history also teaches us that power invites resistance. If Napoleon used such weapons carelessly, the rest of Europe might unite not just to oppose France, but to destroy him at any cost. Consider Moscow, 1812. In reality, Napoleon marched his army deep into Russia, only to find the city abandoned and burned, his men freezing and starving in the winter. It was his greatest blunder, costing him hundreds of thousands of soldiers. With nuclear weapons, he could have changed the outcome. Instead of finding Moscow in flames, he might have unleashed a bomb upon it, reducing it to ash in hours rather than days. But what then? Would the Russians surrender, or would they, in their vastness, fight on with even greater hatred? The destruction of a city might only harden their resolve, transforming the war into a desperate struggle for survival. Waterloo, 1815. The final act of Napoleon's career. His army faced the combined might of Britain and Prussia. In reality, the battle turned against him, and with it, his empire collapsed. But if he had nuclear weapons, that field near Waterloo would never have seen cavalry charges or infantry squares. A single bomb could have erased Wellington's army before the Prussians even arrived. The outcome would be undeniable. Napoleon could have re-established his empire, perhaps even secured domination over Europe itself. But victory through such means would carry a dark shadow. Nuclear weapons leave behind more than destruction. They leave radiation, poisoning the land, killing slowly those who survived the blast. In the 19th century, with no understanding of such dangers, Napoleon's armies might march through contaminated ruins, unaware they were dooming themselves. The weapon that won him Europe could, in time, consume his own soldiers. His empire might rise quickly, but rot from within. The political consequences would be no less dramatic. Napoleon's rule was already controversial. Monarchs saw him as a usurper. Revolutionaries saw him as a tyrant. If he unleashed weapons that erased entire populations, history would remember him not as a genius or reformer, but as a destroyer. His reputation, even among his allies, could collapse. France itself might revolt, horrified at the devastation committed in its name. A ruler who once declared himself the heir of Caesar might instead become the architect of Europe's ruin. Yet there is another possibility. Napoleon, ever calculating, might not use the bombs in battle at all. Instead, he could wield them as tools of diplomacy. He could say to kings and emperors, "Submit," or face annihilation. With only a handful of such weapons, he could bring Europe under his command without firing another shot. The threat alone might be enough to enforce peace. An empire united not by loyalty, but by fear. Comparing this scenario to reality, we see how fragile history truly is. Without nuclear weapons, Napoleon rose and fell like so many conquerors before him. He relied on his genius, but he was limited by the tools of his time. Muskets, horses, cannons, they set the scale of war. But nuclear weapons break that scale entirely. They are not just another tool. They are a game changer, a force that alters the very rules of power. Would Napoleon's empire have endured if he possessed them? Perhaps. He might have ruled Europe unchallenged, perhaps even looked across the seas to America or Asia with dreams of global conquest. Or perhaps his reliance on such destructive force would have sown the seeds of his downfall even faster, alienating allies, poisoning lands, and ensuring his legacy was one of terror, not triumph. In the end, this scenario forces us to reflect on the nature of power itself. Napoleon was one of history's greatest military minds, but even he was bound by the weapons and technologies of his age. To give him the power of the atomic bomb is to hand him a tool humanity itself only barely survived when it finally appeared in the 20th century. The line between victory and annihilation would blur. So we are left with a haunting thought. Had Napoleon commanded nuclear weapons, would he have created a unified Europe centuries before its time, or would he have plunged the continent into an age of fire and ruin from which it might never have recovered? And beyond that, we must ask ourselves, what other turning points of history hang on the edge of technology? What if other empires, other leaders, had weapons beyond their time? What if power itself arrives too soon, before humanity is ready to bear its weight? The answers, like history itself, remain uncertain, but one truth is clear. Nuclear weapons do not simply change battles, they change the destiny of civilizations.